Dr. Michael Brown is Associate Curator of European Art at the San Diego Museum of Art. He has recently published in exhibition catalogs for the Brooklyn Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Museo del Prado, and the current traveling exhibition, The Red That Colored the World, in Santa Ana Bowers Museum. His expertise in the art of colonial South America informs the subject for his paper, An Angel's Song, Painting, Music, and Enlightenment at the Cathedral of San Juan. Please welcome Dr. Brown.
I guess there could be a subtitle for my talk, which is also a question, which is, how does a painting become a piece of music? And I think by the end of my brief remarks today, we might suggest a few parallels and a few things that might not have thought about before when it comes to certain paintings, especially one or two in our collection itself. This talk is really meant as complementary to the exhibition. I'm talking primarily today about an artist whose name is Jose Campeche, who is the most accomplished painter in Puerto Rico of the 18th century and contemporary of Goya's, and like Goya sort of spanned from the late Baroque period right into the early 19th century and the emergence of Enlightenment and even modernity in the Caribbean. And here we're looking at the Cathedral of San Juan in Puerto Rico, which was begun in 1520. This is concurrent with Michelangelo working away at the Sistine Chapel. This structure is being built in the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, the easternmost of the Greater Antilles. And it's here at this cathedral, which of course looks very Italianate to our eyes. It's based on the Gesù in Rome, the facade is anyway, with these very Renaissance kind of forms to it. Well, inside the cathedral takes place an event in the very early 19th century that we're going to come to at the end of the talk, which is sort of a culmination of painting and music in a very special circumstance. And so before we meander down this beautiful little side street through Puerto Rico, through Old San Juan, this is, I think, the Calle de las Monjas, leading to the facade of the cathedral, we need to take a step back and a step back across the Atlantic to understand the context of music within the Spanish Empire, and specifically the site of the royal court in Madrid. And here you can see the Palacio Real in Madrid, which was constructed right in the middle of the 18th century as this is the new palace, replaced a destroyed earlier structure. And it was built by a pair of Italian architects, one, Filippo Juvara, who died before really the first brick was laid and completed by his pupil Sacchetti. But within this palace, this is really a primary venue for music and for not just performance, but also composition and study. So during the 18th century, you had such musical eminences, I suppose, as this character, Carlo Broschi, who we all know better as the castrato Farinelli. This is Jacopo Amagoni's portrait. He's another Italian artist who is resident at the court in Madrid, and Farinelli here, wearing these special royal orders of nobility that were bestowed upon very important people at the court, including musicians. And here we have this lovely group portrait, which can be read equally as a painting and as sort of a musical score if you kind of follow the portraits as musical notes. It's not the only painting or portrait that's like this that we'll see today, but the importance and the high standing of performance and composition, all of this was supported by members of the royal court, from the king and queen to the princes and other nobles in Spain. The context of music, its importance, and its essential quality, really, to court life, really struck me for the first time really even before I had seen that Farinelli portrait, when I sat in the Royal Chapel at the Palacio Real in Madrid on an afternoon when by chance the organist was practicing. I was supposed to be leading a tour, and I sat down, and the tour was well taken care of. I was shirking my duties, and I just listened to the organ. And I realized, looking up at the frescoes by Corrado Giaquinto, an Italian painter employed at the court alongside fellow Italian Tiepolo, who we saw earlier, who also was commissioned to do frescoes at the Royal Palace. This is Giaquinto's work here of the coronation of the Virgin and Spain as protector of the faith. Its official role as protector of the faith is celebrated in these frescoes. Well, I sat there thinking that these paintings could only be understood while this music was playing, or best understood. We typically see slides, silent slides, in art history lectures, but when you actually sit in a structure like this and experience the architecture, the painting, the design, the decoration, the music, it all comes together as a whole. We're talking about the middle of the 18th century here, when all of this was being commissioned and funded by the royal court. And it made me think about really the intersection of music and its importance to painting. And I hadn't really thought about portraiture, which was the subject of my dissertation and most of my publications. I hadn't really thought about portraits as being particularly musical unless there happened to be a musical instrument in them. But in thinking about this talk today and looking back at years of research that I began more than 10 years ago into this artist, Jose Campeche, I realized that we were dealing with a special case here. Jose Campeche, who you can see in two different, and these are later, copies of self-portraits of the artist. One in the middle, this is a copy of Campeche's own self-portrait. This is Francisco Oller's portrait of the artist. Oller's retrospective is currently on right now at the Brooklyn Museum. Jose Campeche was the son of a freed African slave and a white Spanish mother who came to Puerto Rico from Majorca. And Jose Campeche's father was owned by one of the canons of the cathedral, whose last name was Riva Freccia. So his father's name was Tomás Campeche Riva Freccia. And the canon, Riva Freccia, freed Jose's father, but remained very much a part of the cathedral family. And so Jose grew up in the cathedral, learning music, learning oboe in particular, and every keyboard instrument that they had in San Juan. He also played a number of historical instruments and the flute. He sang. He came from, of course, very humble beginnings, but the church remained a center of his life. He never married. Later on in life, he adopted the orphans of freed slaves so that they would not return to slavery. So he did have a family, though not in the traditional sense. And he never had to choose between the arts of painting and the arts of music. Unlike this very famous example of Angelica Kaufmann, who paints this, being really torn, the self-portrait, here she is, torn between, she was a very accomplished musician, and she's torn between music and her ultimate calling, which of course She would rise to these Olympian heights as if she followed painting. Of course, in Puerto Rico, by necessity, by circumstance, Jose Campeche continued through his life to be both a musician and a professional painter. He was also responsible for certain things like repairing the organ when it went down in the cathedral. And I can't think of another figure, at least before the 20th century, of an artist who successfully combined, this being both the leading musician and the leading painter or leading artist in any medium in his or her field. Angelica Kauffman came close, and there are stories of Leonardo da Vinci and so forth, but I think we're dealing in Jose Campeche with a very interesting, practically unique kind of situation. Now, what happened to him? We know that he learned his musical craft with the Carmelite nuns and with the musicians at the cathedral. But from a painting point of view, we know that his father was a decorator and carpenter and gilder. We don't know of any paintings that his father executed that have survived. But one very important episode really changed things for Campeche and for the island of Puerto Rico, which was in 1775, by some very interesting circumstances, one of the leading court portraitists or court painters in Madrid was exiled to Puerto Rico. From 1775 to 1778, Luis Paret y Alcázar was resident in San Juan and served as the mentor. I think that Campeche was already a professional painter at this point, because there are very good paintings that predate Paret's arrival in Puerto Rico, but they worked together now for 3 years and forged this relationship. And you can see here, this is Paret's self-portrait as a Puerto Rican peasant, which is still in Puerto Rico. Here he's got a machete and bananas on his back, very much, he's gone native, so to speak. And here he is in later life, the kind of dandy artist thinking about his exile, these far-off islands. It's this romanticized kind of self-portrait here, where he makes reference to the different liberal arts and ancient philosophers, and even references music here as well. Paret y Alcázar got himself into hot water with none other than the philandering Don Luis de Borbon. And you see the portrait by Anton Raphael Mengs from our collection here, and Luis Paret's portrait of Don Luis. The reason for the exile was because he was the painter. Luis Paret was procuring women for Don Luis de Borbon. Well, Don Luis de Borbon's brother did not appreciate this. He was the king, and so he sentenced his brother to, or at least his brother's painter, to exile, and his brother to near exile just outside of Madrid. So that's how Paret gets himself to Puerto Rico, and that's how Jose Campeche makes the next leap in his artistic development. We can see from about 1775 here, or maybe a few years later, one of his early devotional works, in which we have a nun here who's actually brought 3 African slaves here. It's an ex voto. This is a scene of manumission. We can think of Jose Campeche's father in this here. And so we get a sense of Jose Campeche's biography, I suppose, even though we can't identify the freed slaves here. But Campeche develops into a very accomplished portrait painter, a society portrait painter, in fact. And he's also a music teacher. He teaches the local nobility in San Juan. And so we see here one of his pupils, who we haven't identified her, but she has been identified as the wife of a military officer in the viceregal government in Puerto Rico. And she's got her violin over here with sheet music and so forth. She is a sophisticated, wealthy, well-educated lady and a patron of Jose Campeche. And here, another one of his patrons, Doña Maria Catalina de Urrutia. This is a very recent new acquisition of the Hispanic Society of America in New York, which they, I believe, acquired just a year and a half ago. Anyway, he's really developed into this Rococo, beautiful kind of pink and blue palette, and you can see here he's probably most famous for a suite of ladies on horseback, where they ride side saddle and have they're executing very specific movements of dressage, horsemanship. And of course, the horse is dressed up with bows in his mane and so forth. These are jewel-like, spectacular little paintings. And some of you may remember this painting here, this portrait of two sisters who are the daughters of the governor of Puerto Rico. It was exhibited here at the San Diego Museum of Art in 2005 for the Retratos show, 2,000 years of portraiture. And you can see here, although it looks very much like a Spanish court scene, we have a musical instrument here, a beautifully carved maraca, and it's very difficult to see here in this slide, but there's a pineapple here on the floor, which leaves no doubt as to the Caribbean setting of this work. Don Luis de Borbon actually owned 5 Stradivarius stringed instruments, which are being played in this clip here in the Capilla Real, that royal chapel that I showed earlier. These instruments are still owned by the royal palace, by the royal family, descendants of this same family. I think this is a piece by Luigi Boccherini. But all 5 Stradivarius instruments are being played here. And these instruments are typically on display in Don Luis de Borbon's apartment, what was his apartment, in the Palacio Real, which is part of the museum now. I wanted to give you a chance to hear a little bit of the music that would have played in the Royal Palace in Madrid, and which then translated to other parts of the Spanish Empire. But keyboard instruments were equally, if not more important, to the female elite in Latin America. Here you can see a Mexican portrait, which is in that red show that Anita kindly mentioned on right now at the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana. You can see this portrait there. And it's by an unknown Mexican painter. And on the right is Jose Campeche's portrait of Dolores Martinez de Carvajal, where she's standing in front of one of these keyboard instruments. We believe that, and musicologists may correct me here, but you can see the crank at the bottom of the instrument's furniture, right here. We believe this is an instrument known as the piano organizado, and it was a small harpsichord organ hybrid. Which was made actually on the island of Puerto Rico for a brief time and in Spain. But Jose Campeche would teach his students this instrument. Here you can see the style change from this much darker palette to these really saturated blues and pinks, very rococo, very, very court style, very up to the minute kind of court style. And this is the painting that I want to sort of conclude my remarks on. Now that we have an idea of who this painter is, perhaps his most famous work is this really moving portrait of Juan Pantaleon Aviles, who's a real person, and this is also Campeche's last great painting, his last masterpiece. He died about a year after completing this work. And if we read the inscription at the bottom, the inscription is fairly straightforward. It tells us the name of the little boy, the reason for the painting, which was to celebrate his confirmation. It lists the names of his parents, and also the name of the patron of the portrait, and the fact that there were probably two of these portraits made, both for the Archbishop of San Juan. And it gives us the boy's birth date and also the date of his confirmation. This painting was present at the confirmation. It was there as a celebratory ex voto. So an ex voto, in this sense, was an act or an object of thanksgiving. So it's a visual prayer, and it's a prayer of thanksgiving. And we get a little sense of what's going on here. I haven't even mentioned the fact that this kid has some very serious physical disabilities. He was born without arms and with other impairments. And somehow his parents, who lived in a rural town called Coamo, somehow the Archbishop on one of his travels met the parents, and they presented this child, and he invited them to celebrate the child's confirmation, which took place back in those days, often much earlier than it does now in the Catholic Church, but he was about 2.5. And the Archbishop paid for their travel to San Juan. He paid for the ceremony held at the cathedral to confirm the young boy. He also assigned his physician to the young boy to study and treat his disabilities. And so there was, beyond the compassion and sympathy for this young boy, there was also a scientific interest in treating him and figuring out, why these birth defects really happened. And this is sort of in the vein, a very long-standing vein of, in the Spanish world, in the Spanish Empire, of the affinity for, the respect for, and the compassion for people with disabilities, from those who suffered from dwarfism to Ribera's famous club-footed boy. Not only was he physically disabled in his foot, but also he carries this card which is asking for alms, which suggests that he's also deaf-mute. But he is portrayed with the utmost of dignity as his monumental figure, both of these two characters, actually. And within the Spanish court, there has been this long-standing respect for all of God's creatures. That's what basically what the gist of it is. The Archbishop who arranged for the confirmation. So the confirmation took place in this setting here. You can see the organ within the cathedral, and by this point in his career, Jose Campeche was not only this leading portraitist, he was also the choir master of the cathedral. So he was not only responsible for the visual ex voto of the child's confirmation, he was also responsible for the musical program at the ceremony. So the painting and the music are together here for this very fleeting moment, sort of overseen by this humble artist. And I wanted to play just a very brief clip of music that was composed in the Caribbean and would have been heard at just about this time throughout churches like this in the Caribbean. This is the Cuban-born Esteban Salas as composer here. So we return to that initial question: how does a painting become a piece of music? And in thinking about this, I returned to our own permanent collection here and thought of our great Spanish painting by Zurbarán of the Agnus Dei, which is the Lamb of God. And this is one of the stars of our Spanish Golden Age collection. And it's both a still life and a devotional work. But It's also a crowd favorite, and I'm not sure that I have ever thought of this painting in quite the same way as when I was preparing for this talk. You can see that there's a halo here, and the Lamb of God is presented on this altar-like space. And then there's this inscription in Latin down here, which is a quotation from St. John the Baptist, which is like a lamb. And essentially what this painting is a presentation, allegorical presentation of Jesus as the Lamb of God. And it refers immediately and specifically to a part of the Catholic Mass that any viewer that would have looked at this in 17th century Spain would have looked at this and immediately heard the sung words, and I'll just do it in English, and the mainstream 20th century version is, "Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world." That is a part of the Mass that's sung at every Mass, and it has been sung since the Middle Ages. And so this Zurbaran painting is actually a sung prayer. It is a devotional song. And that's sort of analogous to this image of Juan Pantaleon as a thanks from both the parents who were there to witness their child's confirmation, but have the painting and the music both come from the same author, from Jose Campeche, and to have the archbishop in the audience actually overseeing the ceremony, to have the physician there, the parents, the family, the people of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and this young boy there in celebration. All of these things come together. The painting in the figure of Jose Campeche and in the figure of this young boy, this visual work in essence becomes this angel's song. So thank you very much.